Hi, my name is Raquel Eufeminiano. I'm the school counselor at Highland Park Elementary School. Today I'm going to be talking about CPS and mandated reporting through remote learning. Because of remote learning, it has been pretty difficult to assess what is reportable to CPS and what isn't through a computer monitor. Hopefully, this presentation will be a good review and a good clarification for any answers regarding CPS. So before we start, I wanted to run through the agenda and what we'll be talking about today. We will cover mandated reporters and who they are, neglect and abuse and its definitions and signs to look out for, what is reportable to CPS, what you need to make a CPS report, the process of reporting to CPS, challenges of remote learning, Seattle Public Schools blurb on attendance, and cultural considerations. Lastly, I will also put in contact information if you need additional information regarding CPS reporting or numbers to call. It's important to know who mandated reporters are and what they do. A mandated reporter is a worker who is required by law to report reasonable suspicions of abuse to law enforcement in order to protect children in the community. So some examples of mandated reporters in your community are medical practitioners, nurses, dentists, social service workers and therapists, school personnel, childcare providers, DSHS employees, pretty much anyone who works with children and cares for safety and health. RCW 2644-020 defines abuse and neglect as injury, sexual abuse, sexual exploitation, negligent treatment, or maltreatment of a child by any person under circumstances which indicate that the child's health, welfare, and safety is harmed. Abuse and neglect does not include the physical discipline of a child, as defined in RCW 9A16-100. In my experience as a counselor, neglect is one of the more difficult issues to report due to the type of evidence that is needed. In a little bit, I will also talk about how cultural misinterpretations and how many mandated reporters mistaken neglect for a problem of lacking resources. The Department of Children, Youth, and Families listed signs of neglect as repeated absences, begging or stealing food or money, consistent lack of hygiene, lack of sufficient clothing, drug or alcohol use, no one to provide care at home, or a lack of medical attention. An example that is reportable to CPS is if a child has a tooth pain and the parent refuses to take the child to the dentist. This is considered a medical neglect. I firmly believe that cultural implications must be considered when suspecting neglect of a family. For example, we see children taking care of siblings across cultures. This is especially popular in Mexican and Latino families where family is so tight-knit and they follow a sense of collectivistic upbringing at home. An article by East and Hamill called Sibling Caretaking Among Mexican and American Youth is a research article that discusses and considers these cultural factors. I have cited this article on this slide and I would encourage you to read it. It's a really good research article. But I bring this example up because in my experience, I have had mandated reporters consult with me regarding a sibling taking care of another sibling, and they were curious about whether it was reportable as neglect. It is a very typical situation, and we can see it in our high schooler students or even middle school students. Washington State actually has no set laws on certain ages that a child has to be before babysitting a sibling, and can be as young as 10 to 13. Before jumping to conclusions about whether sibling caretaking is neglect, it's important to understand the culture of the household. Many times, the problem of neglect is actually a problem of a lack of resources. Families who struggle with hygiene, clothing, or finding childcare maybe dealing with a lack of resources and not neglect. So these are just some considerations to take in mind when you are suspecting that there is neglect at home. It's important to be aware of the cultural upbringing of the household, as well as resources that the family may or may not have at home. If you feel like you have concerns regarding neglect or a lack of resources for one of your students, consult with your school's counselor, administration, or the family support worker in your building. If you have suspicions regarding neglect, always contact CPS and follow up with them. Next, we will talk about abuse. Abuse is typically easier to report due to the type of evidence that can be seen and collected. DCYF has named these 3 types of abuse to be reportable to CPS. First is physical abuse. Physical abuse is physical harm done to the child's body. Signs to look out for are unexplained and repeated injuries such as bruises, burns, lacerations, broken bones, etc. Feeling unsafe or fearful of being at home, or extreme or harsh discipline. This includes closed fist hitting or using tools as weapons to inflict bodily harm on a child. The next type of abuse is sexual abuse. Signs of sexual abuse can be difficulty walking or sitting or any other issues regarding the child's private parts. Nightmares or random bedwetting, sudden changes in appetite, bizarre, mature, or developmentally inappropriate sexual knowledge or behavior. This could look like children being fixated on certain private parts or an inappropriate relationship with an adult, or feeling fear and shame when using the bathroom or undressing. Other times, children can bring this up in conversation with you or even in play with other children. The last type of abuse is emotional abuse. This one is also pretty tough to come across and report because of the type of evidence that is needed to make the report, as well as all the cultural implications behind communication in the household. Emotional abuse has similar signs as verbal abuse as well. So signs to look out for are extremes in behaviors or emotions, such as being overly compliant or being overly demanding, extreme passivity or aggression, inappropriate adult-like or infantile behavior, delayed development, suicidal ideation, or a lack of attachment to parents. A good question I normally get asked a lot is what is reportable to CPS and what type of evidence would they need to open up a case? CPS will specifically look at injuries on the child and any other type of physical or verbal evidence of the abuse. Indirect accusations or hearsay reports will most likely be recorded for future reference, but it is typically not enough evidence for CPS to open an investigation. The strongest forms of evidence of abuse are physical injuries on the child or verbal evidence directly from the child. Sexual and emotional abuse and neglect may be more difficult to assess, and any mandated reporter should consult with counselors, admin, or social workers if they have any questions or concerns about a child's safety. So let's say that you are ready to make a CPS call and it is your first time and you don't know what to expect. Here is some information that you may need on board and ready to give when you are making that CPS report. So you will call a social worker, they will pick it up. They will ask for your name and job title as well as your relationship to the child. You may also ask to keep your identity anonymous, so that's something a lot of people don't know, but is something that is good to know. You would also need the name, address, and the age of the child, as well as their date of birth. They'll typically ask for that. The name and addresses of the child's parents, guardians, or caretakers, or the best way for the social workers to find where the child lives. The nature and extent of the abuse or neglect, or any other evidence of previous incidences in the past. Honestly, any information that you may have around the case and the child and the situation is going to be helpful, and this phone call is a really good time for you to be able to tell them everything that you know and that the child has told you. At the end of the phone call, the social worker will give you their name as well as a case number to refer to. It's important to be able to keep these in record in case you need to update the case file, or if you have new information to share, that number will be there for everyone involved in the investigation. A lot of people are curious to know the process of a CPS call after a report has been made. Before I talk you through the process of reporting to CPS and my knowledge and experience, it's important to note that this process can vary depending on the severity of the case. First, a report is made. If there is immediate concern, an investigation will open up. Law enforcement and a social worker will have 24 hours to reach out to the child or family and to do the investigation. They will interview and record both parties' stories, and then from there, they will follow their own protocols that's most appropriate for the situation, which can include placing a child with authorities or other family members if they believe the child is in imminent danger. Other times, they may refer the child or the family to counseling or other support groups for help. And yes, other times the family may go to court depending on the severity of the harm. This definitely would be considered worst-case scenario, but it is in the best interest of the child's safety. If the child is believed to not be in imminent danger, the report will be filed and stored for future reference. In my experience, and I've made dozens of CPS reports, one of the things that I will always stress is that their top priority is the safety of the child. I also understand sorry, that CPS has had a bad reputation of tearing families apart. But I also want to mention that this only has to be done to protect the child from danger. If possible, social workers and law enforcement will do what they can to keep families together. Thank you for making it this far into this video. Now we are going to talk about how remote learning impacts CPS reporting. It honestly has been difficult for me to find any information through the Department of Children, Youth, and Families, DCYF, regarding any new protocols or signs to look out for when reporting for abuse or neglect during remote learning. I actually had to look at other articles for references and to kind of gather ideas and see what other counselors are doing at this time. So, Samantha Schmidt and Hannah Nathanson from the Washington Post reported that CPS reports are lower since remote learning has started. This doesn't necessarily mean there is less abuse and neglect out there. It just means there are less reports being made by mandated reporters. And I think a lot of it has to do with because we no longer have access or opportunities to see our students in person, there is less opportunities to hear about any suspected abuse or neglect. Therefore, less calls are being made. And this silence can be scary for educators who care a lot for their students. And it may also be the reason why schools have been over-vigilant in reporting CPS calls during remote learning at this time. And so this ties in pretty well with another article I found by Carrie McDonald. Carrie discusses cultural considerations of CPS reporting and remote learning. Because we have a window into the homes of students and families, it is easier to be hypervigilant of aggression or yelling in the background. She reports that parents singled out for CPS enforcement are from disproportionately low-income and minority families, often lacking resources to defend themselves against government overreach. And in quoting the Globe, she echoed that most families who are caught up in remote learning allegations are usually Latino or Black families, and are groups that are likely to be overrepresented in state foster care at all times. It is so important as educators to be cognizant of our own cultural awareness and competencies, especially when forming suspicions or allegations around families. We can't know everything through a camera, and we can't know everything about a family's culture and background. This is something that we always have to be our best to be aware of. So we are nearing the end of this video. Before we close out, I wanted to mention Seattle Public Schools and their notion on attendance during this year, during remote learning. So typically before the pandemic started, usually missing excessive amounts of school can be considered educational neglect and is reportable. But because we are in a pandemic, we are going to school virtually, it's important to note that absence does not mean neglect during remote learning. SPS declared that they do not believe that attendance should be used as a punitive measure, especially during this time of remote learning, and that if a student demonstrated a pattern of repeated absences, schools will provide supports for families and students to effectively engage them in remote learning. I know over here at Highland Park Elementary School, we have a fabulous distance support team, and part of our jobs is to engage students and families who have been missing a lot of school days. And just to mention, just for clarification, that signs that do show that your child is attending school is logging into Seesaw and completing assignments, interacting with the class and their teacher, or showing evidence of participating in class. All right, so we made it to the end. Before we wrap up, I just wanted to emphasize cultural considerations again. I know I've mentioned it throughout this video, but definitely something that is important to me and should be important to you and your students as well. It's important to be aware of your students and families' cultural upbringing in the home before making any reports. Mandated reporters should not report families based on what we merely see through a video call. It's much, much different, talking to the children in person, seeing them in person versus the little snippet of what we get from their homes through a short video on the computer screen. Just be cognizant of, accusations and suspicions that you're making against certain families. And I know, as an educator, a lot of it comes from an intentionally very caring place for your students. We worry about our students. We want to make sure they're safe on or off campus, but we should also be aware of the dangers of false reporting and, harming the family's trust, especially during such a weird and unstable and questionable time of this pandemic and remote learning. There's a lot that we don't know. There's a lot that DCYF, hasn't mentioned quite yet. A pandemic is brand new, so we're learning as we go, right? So although there isn't a different protocol or procedure in reporting abuse or neglect through remote learning right now, I think the balance that I've found is that, we should be able to try our best to continue using DCYF's definitions and signs of abuse and neglect when making a CPS report. I think it should stay as similar as we can, and we got to do some modifications when talking to the student, when assessing for safety for the student and families. But if you have any questions or want to make a CPS report, please call the DCYF or CPS line at 1-800-609-8764 or consult with your school's counselor or administration. If you have further questions or concerns regarding mandated reporting, you may use the number below or the link for more information. The Seattle CPS hotline to make reports is 1-800-609-8764. If you just want more information on reporting abuse, you can go to the Department of Children, Youth, and Families website at www.dcyf.wa.gov/safety/report-abuse. For personal consultations, please reach out to your school's administration or your school counselor. Thank you again for making it all the way to the end of this presentation. Stay safe out there, everyone.